Today we're going to be looking at new immigrants. These are Unit 2, Notes number 4. And so we're going to be looking at a new wave of immigration that's happening during the late 1800s and early 1900s, and also how this wave of immigration is way more diverse than kind of the initial colonists that came to America. We'll also be looking at kind of government policies in terms of immigration, how the immigrants were treated, and just kind of how they began to adapt to American life. New immigrants arrive. So Europeans, millions of immigrants were lured by the promise of a better life. Many left their homelands to escape difficult conditions such as famine, land shortages, or religious or political persecution. Between 1870 and 1920, 20 million Europeans arrived in the US. They primarily came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this is a different demographic than the immigrants that came initially during the colonial period. Most of those immigrants were primarily from Northern and Western Europe. So countries like England, Germany, France, Ireland, where now they're coming from different regions in Europe. The countries most dominating Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia. So you're getting a different kind of group of immigrants that did not speak English, that was not their native language. Their look was different, their religious background was different. So we're just getting kind of this new kind of wave of diversity. Many Europeans left due to the rising population in Europe, too few jobs, and scarcity of farmlands. They were looking to come to America to have more opportunity. So Chinese and Japanese immigrants. Between 1851 and 1883, about 300,000 Chinese immigrants arrived on the West Coast. Many came to seek their fortune after the discovery of gold in 1848 in California. Chinese immigrants helped build the nation's railroads, and they eventually turned to farming, mining, and domestic service. In 1898, Japanese immigration to the U.S. began to boom as well. Immigration patterns. So we also had immigrants coming from the West Indies and Mexico. Between 1880 and 1920, about 260 immigrants arrived from the West Indies. They came from Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands. They left their homelands because jobs were scarce, and the industrial boom in the U.S. offered them new opportunities. Mexican immigrants to the U.S. Came to find work and to flee political turmoil in their home country. After 1910, political and social upheavals in Mexico prompted even more immigration. So about 700,000 Mexicans left. That was about 7% of the population left Mexico and came to the U.S. So in this diagram here, this map and chart, we're kind of seeing immigration patterns and where immigrants are relocating. And so we see there's a lot of immigrants from Germany and Ireland, and they will primarily stay kind of in the Midwest, East Coast region. And then when we see in California, we're not seeing as much of that immigration standpoint. And also to notice Mexican immigration. Mexico is in red, and so you see a lot of Mexican immigration to Texas. So it kind of helps to form national identity, where in the Midwest you have things like they're known for bratwurst and pretzels, and you have kind of, because they're coming from this Germanic background, hamburgers and hot dogs, and so you kind of see how these different roots kind of came to be based on the immigrant population that settled in these regions. Difficult journey. By the 1870s, almost all immigrants traveled by steamship. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe took about 1 week, while the Pacific crossing from Asia took nearly 3 weeks. Many immigrants traveled in steerage. That's the cheapest accommodation in a ship's cargo hold. So basically, they're living where the ship is storing all of its goods. This isn't, a Carnival cruise ship. They don't have luxurious cabins. There's no buffet. They are stuck at the bottom. They aren't even allowed up on deck at times, and were unable to exercise or catch a breath of fresh air. They're just kind of stuck for a week in the cargo hold. And you can imagine those conditions were not great. They had lots of probably rodents running around, bed bugs, lice. And so, because they were in these kind of cramped quarters, these conditions helped to increase the spread of disease, and many immigrants died before even reaching their destination. For those who did survive, the first glimpse of America was breathtaking to them. And so here you have this picture. And so it kind of just shows the immigrants coming. They were bringing with them whatever they could bring, whatever they could carry. But it also was limited. They're going to be in the ship's cargo hold. They're not bringing with them 10 or 12 bags of stuff. So they're bringing, a few items. They're wrapping stuff around them to start their new life. So let's stop and think. Why would immigrants want to come to America? They are risking leaving their homeland. In some cases, their homeland, they're experiencing horrible things, famine, possible political unrest. And so maybe they want to leave, but still you're leaving everything you know behind. You're making a long, dangerous journey coming to America. You're coming to a land that you possibly don't know the language, you've never been, and just starting completely fresh. So for people to want to do that, you have to be completely motivated. And so most of these immigrants wanted a better life. They wanted to work. They wanted to give their children better opportunities. And so I think these instances of why immigrants want to come to America, whether it was in 1900 or in 2020, it's very similar. It's very timeless. Those things don't change. People want to work. They want opportunities. And so one thing to kind of stop and think as we're talking about this is how much of these immigration ideas haven't changed in over 100 years. How people feel about immigrants, how the government responds to them. And so we kind of see a lot of the same happening today. Arriving in America, Ellis Island. Immigrants would have to pass inspection at immigration stations. So Ellis Island was in New York. Immigrants would have to pass a physical examination by a doctor and report to a government inspector. So part of the physical examination, they're making sure that the immigrants don't have any diseases, they aren't sick, that they are in good health. If they possibly had maybe like the flu, they would have been quarantined. And then once the illness had passed, they would have been allowed to enter the U.S. If it was something more serious, then they would have been sent back home. Immigrants had to meet legal requirements like having never been convicted of a felony and showing that they had some money. So they would have to show papers to kind of show that they were in good standing with the country that they had left, to show that, they weren't coming to America, they weren't a criminal. Angel Island. So while European immigrants who arrived on the East Coast passed through Ellis Island, Asian immigrants arrived on the West Coast and would pass through Angel Island in San Francisco. Immigrants here endured harsh questioning and a long detention while they waited to be admitted. And so we're kind of starting to see the difference in terms of how European immigrants were treated, and then also Asian immigrants not always as welcomed. Between 1910 and 1940, about 50,000 Chinese immigrants entered the U.S. Immigration struggles. Once admitted to the country, immigrants face the challenges of finding a place to live, getting a job, and getting along in daily life while trying to understand an unfamiliar language and culture. Many immigrants sought out people who shared their cultural values, practiced their religion, and spoke their native language. They wanted to be surrounded by people like them. And so we began to see the formation of these ethnic communities, and these became life rafts for immigrants. So some examples would be, Chinatown in San Francisco, Little Italy and Harlem in New York. So most major big cities have these neighborhoods that are kind of um, dominated by one particular ethnic group, where maybe you have, a Greek area of a city, you have Greek restaurants, and most of the people of a Greek background live there because they want to be surrounded by people like them that speak their language. And within these communities, they would open up their own churches. So if you had a Jewish neighborhood, they would open up a synagogue, and so they could all feel supported by one another. Native born people often disliked the immigrants' unfamiliar customs and languages and viewed them as a threat to the American way of life. So, because they were different, people didn't necessarily like the diversity. They didn't like that it was unfamiliar to them, they couldn't understand it. So, instead of being kind of accepting of something new and different, they viewed it as change and a threat. And this viewpoint still doesn't change today. Many people feel the same way. Immigration restrictions. Many native born Americans thought of their country as a melting pot, a mixture of people of different cultures and races who blended together by abandoning their native language and customs. Basically, the idea of becoming assimilated. Yes, you have come to America. Now we speak English. We dress in an American way. But many new immigrants did not want to give up their cultural identity. So you have this kind of conflict of, yes, you're in America now. Many of the older native born Americans felt that they should have adapted and assimilated to a more American custom. Um, but many new immigrants, they liked their ways. And so they didn't want to have to change that. One response to the growing immigration was nativism, or overt favoritism towards native born Americans. And we talk about this native born Americans, and we've discussed, the colonies, and all the people that came to establish the colonies came from other countries. They came from England, they came from France, they came from Germany, they came from Scandinavia. And so because they came, 150 years ago, now their ancestors feel like this is their country, and they kind of forget their ancestors' roots and their heritage, and don't like the new wave that's coming. So nativism gave rise to anti-immigrant groups and led to a demand for immigration restrictions. Many nativists did not object to immigrants from the right countries. And by right countries, they meant English speaking countries. So if you were coming from England, Scotland, Ireland, or countries where people had more fair skin, Germany, France, those immigrants were okay. But it was just the immigrants that were more diverse. Nativists sometimes objected to immigrants' religious beliefs than to their ethnic backgrounds. So they targeted immigrants that were Jewish or Roman Catholic that did not practice the Protestant faith. In 1897, Congress passed a bill requiring literacy tests for immigrants. They would have to be able to read at least 40 words in English. So, again, penalizing immigrants that did not come from English speaking countries. Anti-Immigration Laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the West, native-born workers feared that jobs would go to Chinese immigrants who would accept lower wages. And so this connects to our notes from earlier in the week about the labor movement. And so we see labor unions forming, trying to fight for higher wages. And when they see immigrants accepting the same job for lower work, it kind of messes up, all of the struggles and the fights that they're trying to make. So specifically, the labor movement was very anti Chinese immigration at this time period in the West. So they lobbied for Congress to kind of stop this from happening. So in 1882, Congress ended Chinese immigration for 10 years by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act banned entry to all Chinese except students, teachers, merchants, tourists, and government officials. So basically anyone with kind of a higher level of jobs. In 1892, the law was extended for another 10 years and it was not repealed until 1943. So, just an example of the government trying to limit immigration and just this mistreatment of immigration and kind of how these nativist views influenced laws. So, lastly, let's stop and think. What difficulties did immigrants face in America? Well, first and foremost, adjusting to a new life. Many of these immigrants came to America not knowing the language, so it's completely new to them. So they're having to overcome that barrier. They're having to find a job that to support themselves. They may have came over with a little bit of money, but they weren't very well off. They have to work in order to sustain their lifestyle. They're also having to deal with these nativist anti-immigrant sentiment in terms of people not wanting them to be in America. Um, Challenges of just kind of being accepted in America, finding a job, um, finding a place, being able to adapt to American lifestyles. So there was a lot of difficulties that immigrants would have to overcome in order to become successful and thrive. But many of them did. Many of them did. It's just initially there is a lot of obstacles, a lot of hurdles to overcome. So we're done. This is the end of the notes. Make sure you go back, look at your key terms. Make sure to get ready for the quiz next week.